Welcome to Tanakh Talk. I'm your host, William Hall, broadcasting live from Kingsland, Texas, USA, with another episode of A Rabbi Cross-Examines the New Testament with Rabbi Michael Skobac. Tonight we're hitting on Hebrews chapter 3. Let me get your mic turned back. I turned up to right. There we go. How are you, sir? It's always such a delight when we get together and listen to your teachings, and especially on this whole New Testament concept is just really amazing. I know
Good to be back with you.
Thank you very much. Very nice. Good to be here as well. So Hebrews chapter 3. I had the title up. What was the title? I forgot. Oh, another swing and miss. I like that. Very good. Very good. All right, well, I guess we can kick this baby off. I'll turn it over to you and let you have at it. Thanks again.
So, Hebrews chapter 3, it begins with the assertion that Jesus is considered to be a high priest. And this is actually a theme that's going to come up in chapters 4 and 5 and 6 and 7. It's a major theme throughout the book of Hebrews. And I figured we'll tackle it tonight. And, one of the impressions you get when you read the book of Hebrews is that it's almost like a kid in a schoolyard bragging, my dad's greater than your dad and whatever. And so the theme of this chapter really is that Jesus is greater than Moses. And in the previous chapters, we saw that the writer is trying to show that Jesus is greater than the angels. And we're going to see in the future that Jesus is greater than the high priests. He's the best. He's the greatest. So we're not going to talk about that so much tonight, the best and better and greatest, but just the whole question of Jesus being considered a high priest. Now, in Christian thought, it's extremely important to have Jesus given a priestly role, because they see that his offering himself up as a sacrifice to atone for the sins of the world is a central part of his messianic mission. In fact, the kingly role of the Messiah, Jesus did not fulfill, meaning that all of the prophecies in the Tanakh about the Messiah being a king and presiding over a restored world and a transformed world, none of these prophecies happened. And those are all basically relegated to what Christians refer to as the second coming of Jesus. And so since Jesus struck out in terms of the kingly functions of the Messiah, Christianity had to come up with an alternative role for him, meaning what did he accomplish? And so this is the whole idea that in his first advent, he came to really be a sacrifice. He came to offer himself as a sacrifice to atone for sin. And so we normally associate the Messiah, the Davidic Messiah. David was a king. And so what Christianity had to try to do was to show that Jesus was not just a king, because that he hasn't done yet, but they want to show that he has this function as priest, the high priest, they say, because they see that a major part of what Jesus came to do was to really secure atonement for people through offering himself up as a sacrifice. Now, of course, this runs into a very serious problem, because the kingship and the priesthood have two different genealogical lines. The Messiah, we're told, will be a king, and all of the major prophecies about the Messiah speak about him as a king. And we know that kings in the Tanakh have to trace themselves back to the tribe of Judah through the line specifically of David and Solomon. And that's one of the clearest criteria of the Messiah. One of the clearest things that the Tanakh says about the Messiah is that he must be a descendant of King David, and specifically through his son Solomon. Now, this is why the Gospels expend so much effort in Matthew chapter 1 and in Luke chapter 3 to try and establish this genealogical connection for Jesus. Now, we've discussed in past shows that there is a boatload of problems trying to make that connection genealogically between Jesus and the royal Davidic line. And that's not going to be our issue tonight. We've covered that in the past. The problem we're going to focus on tonight is that if Jesus was a descendant of David, if that's the case, then he could not be a high priest, or any priest for that matter, because priests had to be from a different tribe. Priests were not from the tribe of Judah. Priests were from the tribe of Levi, and specifically not any person from the tribe of Levi, but a descendant of Aaron, the brother of Moses. Those were the priests. The priests specifically were the descendants of Aaron. And so this presents what I would refer to as a checkmate conundrum for Jesus, because if they want him to be both a king and a priest, he has to have two genealogical lines. He has to be both a descendant of David and a descendant of Aaron, which is basically a mathematical impossibility. And this problem has driven Christian apologists to desperately seek some kind of argument to advance their claim that no, you can be both a king and a priest, meaning that what they're going to try to demonstrate is that you can have one person that serves in the role of both a king and a priest. So what I'd like to do tonight is look at a number of these so-called proofs that are advanced by Christian apologists. I want to thank someone that sent me a letter from Israel this week, an email, asking me about this question. And the argument that he wanted me to address will be the first one that I'll speak about tonight, which is from the first book of Samuel, Samuel 1, chapter 21, verse 7. So we see in this passage in Shmuel Aleph in 1 Samuel that Achimelech, who was a priest in the city of Nov, he gives David some of the sacred bread. Now, this, according to Christian apologists, supposedly shows that David can be both a king and a priest, meaning that we know that throughout Tanakh, David is always referred to as the king. He became one of the greatest kings of Israel. And so what the Christian apologist wants to show is that not only is David a king, but also a priest. And the argument is here that since David is eating some of the sacred bread from the city here of Nob, he has to be a priest as well, because who else would be able to eat this bread? Now, the starting point for deconstructing this fallacy is not to make the mistake that Christians make of ignoring the context of this passage in 1 Samuel. And this is quite important to remember. The context of this passage in 1 Samuel, it's not a chapter that is dealing with the laws of the priesthood, meaning that if you study this chapter, the context here, the theme, is not teaching us anything. It's not here to teach us about the parameters and the laws of what priests are and who priests are. The context is quite different. The context is King Saul's war against David. That's what's going on here. That's the context. The context is that David, as in many stories in the book of Samuel, David is fleeing for his life. He's running away from King Saul, who's trying to kill him. And in this chapter, David is famished. He's very hungry. And he shows up in the city of Nov, which is a city that was basically entirely occupied by priests. And he meets Achimelech, one of the priests, and he asks what food is available. Because obviously he's very, very hungry. He's probably been running away for a while. And when you're on the run, you can't just stop off and get food somewhere. So in this city, if we understand how priests normally lived, they were sustained and nourished by what is referred to as truma. Truma was the special offering that was given to the priests by the rest of the Israelites. We know that the Levites, for example, who assisted the priests, so Levites received what is referred to as maaser, which was a tithe. It was 10% of people's produce went to the Levites. Now, there were many, many more Levites than priests, because the priests, the descendants of Aaron, was just one family within the tribe of Levi. So the Levites would get 10% from people's crops. The priests would get something called truma, and that was on the average of about 2%, and that really came off the top first. So if a person had 100 bushels of produce, 2 would go to the priests, and then from the remaining 98, 10% of that would go to the Levites. But this is how the priests basically ate. The priests didn't have to work. The priests didn't farm. They didn't really do anything else. They served as priests, as we'll see later. I'll discuss this. And they were nourished. They were fed by these offerings called truma. Now, there was an extremely strict prohibition for any non-priest to eat truma. This is something that was totally forbidden to a non-priest. So Achimelech didn't give any truma to David. David was asking for food. He's hungry. And this is something which he couldn't receive as a non-priest. He doesn't get truma. It would be interesting. I mean, for the Christian proof here, it would have been wonderful if Achimelech said, yeah, we have a whole bunch of truma we can give you, since you're obviously also a priest, not just a king, not just from the line of Judah. So Achimelech does not give him any truma. Now, the truth is that if David was famished to the point where his health was in danger, he could have eaten truma. We know that in Torah law, you generally speaking can violate laws of the Torah to save your life. If someone is, deathly ill and they have to eat pork, they can eat pork if there's no other food available. And if they're deathly ill and they have to eat on the Day of Atonement, when normally we're supposed to fast, you eat on the Day of Atonement. So the truth is, if David was really famished to the point where his health was in danger, he could have eaten truma. But that would only be if no other food was available. But the truth is, there were 2 other possibilities for food for David. from the priests. One was the showbread. It's called in Hebrew lechem hapanim, and this was put on the table. There was one of the things in the sanctuary was called the shulchan, the table, and every Shabbat, every Sabbath, they put these loaves of bread on the shulchan. We find this described in the book of Vayikra in Leviticus chapter 24, verses 5 through 9. Now, it's possible that what Achimelech could have given David would have been some of the leftover showbread from the previous Sabbath. The only thing that Achimelech would have wanted to ensure would be that it would be eaten by David and his men when they were ritually pure, meaning if they had not become defiled through ritual impurity. And we see that in verses 5 to 6 in this chapter, Achimelech actually wants to get that assurance from David that he and his men are not going to be eating this when they're ritually impure. The other possibility is that Achimelech could have given David from the Lachmei Toda. There were loaves of bread that were brought every time there was a Korban Toda, a thanksgiving offering. And this is something that was certainly edible by non-priests. A non-priest could eat such bread with no questions asked. Again, as long as they ate it when they were when these people eating it would be ritually pure, meaning they hadn't come into contact with things that would render them impure. Now, there's absolutely no suggestion in this chapter that David had the status of a priest, that is able to eat truma, the special offerings that were only given to the priests. The Christian twisting of this story would have to also assume that all of David's men were also somehow transformed into priests as a result of their eating the bread that was provided by Achimelech. But the point is that in this story, we don't see any moment where the scripture is telling us that David was a priest. All we're told is that David was hungry and he needed bread. It seemed to be some kind of emergency. And so if the passage wanted to really tell us somehow that there was a connection between David and the priesthood, it might have even said that he was given truma. But again, even that would not have been a proof, because again, in a situation where your life's in danger, then he even would be able to eat truma, which would normally be forbidden to a non-priest. But the passage doesn't even have Achimelech giving him truma, because again, there would be no excuse for doing so if there was other food available. And there was. There was either the lechem hapanim, the showbread, or the lachmei toda, the bread that was offered with the Thanksgiving offerings, which again, a non-priest could eat as long as they were ritually pure. And so there's nothing in this story, nothing that can be used to prove that we should consider David to be a priest. It's basically just grasping for straws. Now, another proof that is used by Christians, and it actually is going to come up in the book of Hebrews, is from Psalm 110, verse 4, where it seems in the psalm that David is told, "You are a priest forever after the manner of Melchizedek." You are a priest forever, he's told, after the manner of Melchizedek. Now, if this passage is telling us something about King David, what we have to understand is what manner of priesthood from Melchizedek it's referring to. Meaning when it says that you're a priest forever after the manner of Melchizedek, so what manner is that referring to? What does it actually mean? So we have to understand who Melchizedek was and in what way he was a priest. So we know that Melchizedek was an important person who lived at the time of Abraham. And during that time, we know, there was no temple and there were no laws of the Levitical priesthood. So the truth is that anyone on the planet would have been able to offer sacrifices during the time of Melchizedek. Offering sacrifices was not a privilege that was reserved only to people like Melchizedek. Again, the idea of a Levitical priesthood as an institution was only established in the book of Exodus. And it's only after that special designation of the descendants of Aaron as a Levitical priesthood, the Aaronic priesthood, that the sacrificial service was exclusively in the domain of the descendants of Aaron. So again, it's anachronistic to somehow impose upon Melchizedek laws that didn't really come into existence until much later. At the time of Melchizedek, there was no exclusivity at his time in terms of priests offering sacrifice. That could have been done by anyone. So in what way was Melchizedek then a priest? What was the manner of Melchizedek's priesthood? So we're told in Genesis chapter 14, verse 8, that Melchizedek was the king of Shalem. He was a king. And one of the universal tasks of the priesthood was to administer justice. We see this in Deuteronomy chapter 17, verse 9. That was one of the tasks of the priesthood. And this is something clearly that would also apply to a king. So it's probably, the most likely way of understanding this idea of the priesthood of Melchizedek is that as the king of Shalem, he was in charge of, or he was at least involved in, administering justice, because that's something that later on the priests would do as well. And that's something that would be specifically relevant, obviously, to a king. And so when it says in Psalm 110, verse 4, that David is a priest in the manner of Melchizedek, what it's saying is that in the same way that Melchizedek served in this capacity of administering justice, David would share that priestly role with Melchizedek as well. But again, in Psalm 110, where it speaks about David being a priest like Melchizedek, it has nothing to do with the role of the priesthood in terms of offering sacrifices. Because again, at the time of Melchizedek, that wasn't something that was unique to his priesthood. Now, this idea of the king, and David here, the king, and Melchizedek, the king, the idea that their specific role is to administer justice. So we see this in Isaiah chapter 11, where it speaks about one of the main responsibilities of the Messiah will be to judge the people. Again, that's what we see in Deuteronomy chapter 17, verse 9, which speaks about the priests judging. And in Isaiah chapter 11, it says that this is, again, one of the primary functions of the Messiah. Everyone agrees that Isaiah chapter 11 is about the Messiah, would be to judge the people. Now, Genesis 14 again mentions nothing, zero, about Melchizedek's offering sacrifices to atone for sin. So again, it's important to understand what the Christian is trying to prove here and why their proof falls on its face. Because they cannot use Melchizedek as a way of showing that just like Melchizedek was someone whose role was to offer sacrifices specifically to atone for sins, and if David was like that, then David has this alternative role, not just to be the political ruler as king, but that David should also have this role of offering a priest that would offer sacrifices for sin. There's nothing at all that is established there, because again, we don't have anything in Genesis 14 about Melchizedek's priesthood involving his offering sacrifices to atone for sins. So there's no connection here that can be established between King David and the priestly role of offering sacrifices, specifically for sins. Now, had the scripture in, let's say, Psalm 110, had the scripture wanted to make it clear that the Messiah would be involved in sacrifices to expiate sin, so it would not have referred to David being a priest according to the manner of Melchizedek. It would have said that David is a priest according to the manner of Aaron, meaning the Aaronic priesthood, because the Aaronic priesthood specifically was the only group who had any involvement with the offering of sacrifices. So that really would have been what Psalm 110 should have said, had that been the intention of the psalmist. But again, what I'm trying to show is that by bringing up Melchizedek, it doesn't help the Christian make their case that somehow the king is able to have this priestly role that involves the offering of sacrifices. Now, another point to bear in mind is that the entire people of Israel are explicitly referred to as priests in the Tanakh. You see this in Exodus chapter 19, verse 6, where it says, before the revelation at Mount Sinai, God says to the entire people, you will be a mamlechet kohanim. You'll be a kingdom of priests. And this is also stated in Isaiah chapter 61, verse 6, that the people of Israel are God's priests. So, of course, this does not mean that every single Israelite can then be involved in offering sacrifices in the temple. Again, this would be the the implication that the Christians are trying to make. That is, as soon as someone has any connection to being called a priest, that means they have this priestly role of offering sacrifices. And again, that was the attempt by saying David is a priest like Melchizedek. Then the assumption is that David must be someone involved with the offering of sacrifices. We saw how that falls apart, because there's nothing in the Bible about Melchizedek offering sacrifices, that being part of his priestly role. But the truth is that if Christians want to press this point and insist that everyone that's referred to as a priest has a role that involves the offering of sacrifices, that would be a big problem, because Israel, every Israelite is referred to as a priest, and yet we know that the Bible specifically eliminates, everyone in Israel from that role of being involved with the offering sacrifices, except for the descendants of Aaron, meaning that just being a priest, that was not the only role of priests. That's really the mistake that Christians make, is to assume that priest has one connotation, and that means bringing sacrifices. And that's just an incredible mistake, and as I'm going to show right now. Because there are other roles of the priesthood that can be embraced by all Jews, meaning that when the Tanakh in Exodus 19:6 and in Isaiah 61:6 refers to the people of Israel as priests, it doesn't have to refer to, and it can't refer to, a role involving the offering of sacrifices. They're eliminated from that. So what does it mean that there are priests? So we see that throughout the Tanakh, there is a major role that priests have. Let's look at some of these sources. If we go to Leviticus chapter 10, verse 11, Leviticus chapter 10, verse 11, we're told that the priests are to teach the children of Israel all the decrees that Hashem has spoken to them through Moses. We see here in Leviticus chapter 10, it describes that one of the roles of the priesthood is to teach the decrees of God to the children of Israel. That's one of their major roles. And we're going to see that this role of being teachers is repeated throughout the Tanakh. So, for example, in Deuteronomy chapter 33, verse 10, we know at the end of Deuteronomy, when Moses blesses all the tribes, so in his blessing to the tribe of Levi, in the blessing to the tribe of Levi, he says, "They shall teach your ordinances to Jacob and your Torah to Israel." Meaning one of the roles of the tribe of Levi was to teach Torah. And we see this repeated over and over and over again. So, for example, in Ezekiel chapter 44, verses 23 to 24, it speaks about the priests, and it says the following: "They shall instruct my people concerning the difference between the holy and the profane, and they will inform them of the difference between the impure and the pure. And concerning a disagreement, they shall stand in judgment, and they shall adjudicate them according to my laws. They shall safeguard my teachings and my decrees regarding all of my appointed times, and they shall sanctify my Sabbaths." So again, in the book of Ezekiel, we see that one of the roles of the priests was again to be teachers. And then we see in the prophet Malachi, in chapter 2, we see the following. In Malachi chapter 2, verse 6, he addresses in this chapter the Kohanim, the priests. If you go to Malachi chapter 2, verse 1, the chapter begins by talking here, we're talking to the priests. And he says in verse 6, "The teaching of truth was in his mouth, and injustice was not found on his lips. He walked with me in peace and with fairness, and turned many away from iniquity." And then in verse 7, in chapter 2, Malachi goes on to say, "For the lips of the priest should safeguard knowledge, and the people should seek teaching from his mouth, for he is an agent of Hashem, an agent of God." So again, over and over again, we see that this is a critically important role of the priests, which is to be teachers. And Malachi in this chapter goes on to rebuke those priests who did not fulfill this teaching responsibility. And so it is in this manner, when the Tanakh speaks about all of Israel as priests, it's in this manner that all of Israel are priests. Not that they offer sacrifices in the temple. They're not allowed to. But in the manner that the priests, the Levitical priests and the Aaronic priests, the Levites and the Aaronic priests, everyone from this tribe, they serve as teachers of the rest of the Israelites. So when the Tanakh speaks about the Israelites as priests, it means that we serve that role vis-a-vis the rest of the world. And why is this? Because we know that in ancient Israel, as I mentioned before, I actually didn't mention this. When we think about this, what did the priests do? If, again, people make the mistaken assumption of thinking the priests served in the temple and the priests brought sacrifices. But the truth of the matter is that the typical priest only served in the temple or in the tabernacle 1 or 2 days in the entire year. They were only there 1 or 2 days the entire year because they had rotations so that every priest could get a chance. I mean, you couldn't have thousands of priests doing the service in the tabernacle or in the temple every day. There weren't that many things to do. So there was a rotation, and every priest got there 1 or 2 days, whatever it was, to serve in the temple. And so the question is, what did they do for the rest of the year when they weren't serving in the temple? So this is now understandable. They taught the people. That's why when I showed that a major role of the priesthood was to be teachers, we understand why. Because they only served in the temple and involved with the sacrificial service for a very brief period of time. And so for the rest of the year, they didn't have to farm. They didn't have to do other kinds of work. They were actually supported by the tithes and the offerings of the rest of the nation so that they could spend all of their time teaching. So when Exodus chapter 19, verse 6 and Isaiah chapter 61, verse 6 are saying that Israel, the nation of Israel, has this role of being priests, it means that vis-a-vis the rest of the world, Isaiah says that we are to be teachers. That's what it means when it says that Israel are priests. We're to be teachers. And that's why Isaiah says in chapter 42, verse 6 and 49, verse 6, Isaiah says that Israel is to be a light to the nations, a light in terms of illuminating them, teaching them. And in chapter 60, verses 1 to 3, Isaiah says that one day the nations of the world will come to the light of the Jewish people, meaning that for most of our history, we just were there being a light, right? But the world had to be ready to listen to the teaching. That's not been our experience for most of our history. We've been there as a light, but Isaiah says one day the world will come to your light. And that's why you find, for example, that Zechariah chapter 8 speaks about this in verse 23, that in the future, Zechariah says that people from all over the world are going to grab hold of a Jew and then they say, please teach us about God because we know that God is with you. So this is the major role of the Jewish people as priests. But the point is that it doesn't mean that they have a role as being involved with the sacrificial service. Now, another argument that's offered, I found actually here in David Stern. He's one of the Messianic Jews in Israel now who has a commentary to the Christian Bible. So David Stern, in his commentary to Hebrews chapter 3, verse 1, he offers a bizarre argument to establish the priestly credentials of Jesus. He writes that in Hebrews 7:25, we'll get there later, he says, we see there that Jesus made intercession for the people. And Stern then quotes Exodus chapter 32, verse 32, where it says Moses interceded on behalf of the people after the sin of the golden calf. So Stern concludes in his commentary that we see from here Jesus fulfilling the role of a priest. Now, there are several problems with this. Problem number one is that Moses was not a priest. Moses was a Levi. He was a Levi, but he wasn't a priest. He didn't serve in the same role as Aaron. And there's no implication in Exodus chapter 32 that he was serving as a priest. And the reason is that intercession basically means prayer. And this could be done by anyone, not only priests. You didn't have to be a priest to pray on behalf of others. And so this parallel to Moses does absolutely nothing to establish Jesus as a priest. It's hard even to understand what David Stern was trying to get at, to use this argument that just like Moses made intercession, Jesus made intercession, that makes Jesus a priest. Nothing doing. So these are three arguments that are, that come up from time to time in order to try again to establish this idea that the kingly line, the Davidic line, could also be a priest in the sense of the Aaronic priesthood. And again, that's the goal that Christian theologians have. They don't want to find just any priestly role for Jesus. They're not trying to find a teaching role for Jesus. They're trying to find this sacrificial, meaning in the sense that a priest offers sacrifices in the temple. They want to show that somehow a king from the line of David can also have that function. You have all of these attempts that I tried to show tonight that simply, they don't work. They do not serve to prove what the Christians are trying to prove. It's unfortunately for them, it's a massive failure. And as we go through the rest of the book of Hebrews, we're going to come back to this theme of Jesus as the high priest over and over again. But I thought that tonight this would be an introduction, at least, to some of the problems with this idea. There's nothing else really I had for this chapter. It's actually quite,
right.
I don't want to say boring, but to me it struck me as boring.
Well,
there wasn't much to bite into. But this is the only thing I really wanted to address in this chapter, was this claim at the very beginning that Jesus somehow was the high priest. And again, we will get back to this because it's a central theme in the book of Hebrews. So
very cool. Well, you sure pulled a lot of it out for it to be so boring. All the resources were kind of hard to follow along with. It was so good. I'm gonna have to enjoy listening to this one several times, especially this title. I mean, not the title itself, but I mean the whole point of this about Jesus not being the high priest and king. That's a very intriguing thing for most Christians. Would probably hate to hear that, unfortunately. So, yeah,
it needs to be studied. I
mean,
sir. I think the sources have to be gone through, and I think again, what happens is people have sort of simple associations. There's sort of a simple mistaken association to just almost like a caricature to say, oh, priest, that must mean bringing sacrifices, right? So that if somehow Jesus is called a priest, like now he's not called an Aaronic priest, right? He's called a priest like Melchizedek was a priest. So again, the assumption that they make is a wrong assumption, to assume that any person that somehow is referred to as a priest, they have a role in offering sacrifices. So I tried to show that no, every Jew is referred to, every Israelite is referred to as a priest. It doesn't mean they have some connection to offering sacrifices, because again, the Bible is very clear. It is only the descendants of Aaron that serve in the temple and offer sacrifices. So what the Christian needs to understand is that the role of the priesthood is complex. There's not only one aspect to the priesthood. And actually this just makes sense, because the bringing of sacrifices was a very minor part of what the priests did during the year. Most of their time was spent teaching. And then I showed that another, which is related to the teaching aspect, is the judging aspect. Because again, just think about it, who had the time to sit and become an accomplished Torah scholar in the times of the Bible? Again, most people were busy with their flocks or with their crops. They were working very hard. The priests and the Levites were supported, and they had time to devote themselves to studying the Torah, and that's why they were qualified to teach the Torah, and that's why they were qualified to judge, to adjudicate. So in Deuteronomy 17, we're told, who do you go to when you need to judge cases that are difficult? You go to the priests, who were often the judges, because these are the people that had time to devote themselves to studying. And so that's another sort of related aspect to the priesthood, was that they were basically designated as those who would really be involved with justice, with making sure that justice was served by declaring what was just, by deciding what was just. And that's certainly an aspect of a king's role that they have in common with the priesthood, to be involved with the administration of justice. So as soon as we understand really the complex nature of what a priest is all about, and the distinctions between the Aaronic priesthood and someone like Melchizedek, who is referred to as a priest, but he's not an Aaronic priest. He has nothing to do. That institution didn't exist yet when Melchizedek walked the earth. So it just means not being superficial when you read the Bible, not to assume that, Melchizedek is called a priest, Aaron is a priest, they must be the same thing, and if Jesus is a priest, he must be the same thing, and if David, you can't read the Bible superficially. You have to think about what's being said, you have to analyze it, you have to come up with definitions, and know, we can't tell the players apart without a scorecard. And so we must know exactly what the definitions are, what a priest is, what the roles of a priest are. And therefore, when it speaks about somehow David having this connection to the priesthood, right, we have to know what that means and what it doesn't mean. What it doesn't mean is what the Christians would like you to think it means, which is that just like the priests were involved with the offering of sacrifices, David was also involved with the offering of sacrifices, and as a descendant of David, Jesus had this role of a priest involved with sacrifices, and that's why he was able to serve as a high priest who, now this again is a different discussion, but the idea that he offered himself up as a sacrifice is a different discussion. Does a high priest offer himself as a sacrifice? That's not for tonight. But just the idea of the Christian has this need to somehow get Jesus to become a priest who has a role in the offering of sacrifices. And I explained why, because they need an alternative job description for Jesus. He certainly did not fulfill the kingly function of the Messiah, who would be the ruler of Israel at a time when the world has become perfected under the messianic reign, where everyone in the world believes in God and everyone is living at peace. That didn't happen in the time of Jesus. They insist that's going to happen when Jesus returns, and that's why Christianity came up with this alternative universe, this alternative job description for the Messiah, where he dies as a sacrifice, and they believe he offered himself up as a sacrifice. Well, who can offer sacrifices? Only a priest. And so it's sort of an involved and unfortunate mess that they get themselves into, and that they need to be able to somehow demonstrate that Jesus, and not just Jesus, but any Davidic king has this role of priest in the terms of being involved with the offering of sacrifices. So that's what I tried to show tonight, is that there's no such connection, no such role. These are separate roles. They do not mix at all. As a matter of fact, I'll just end with this. in Jewish history, there was a group of priests who tried to usurp the kingly role, the role of the kings, and those were the Maccabees, the Hasmoneans. We know that the Hashmonaim were priests. They were Kohanim, and we know that after they kicked the Syrian Greeks out, they didn't just continue serving in the temple. They became, in effect, the political rulers, and that was a mistake. That was a violation of their role. That was not the role they were supposed to have. That was a role that's reserved for descendants of David. So we see in Jewish history, when people try to mix these roles and combine these roles, they're held accountable. It's not considered to be a good thing. It's considered to be actually very sinful. So if any descendant of David, tried to serve in the temple bringing sacrifices, that would have been a horrible sin, because they had no right to be offering sacrifices in the temple. That was not their role. So I hope I was able to make that clear tonight, and God willing, next time we meet, we will continue with chapter 4 in Hebrews.
Absolutely. That sounds like a great plan. Well, I really appreciate your time. Once again, thank you all for tuning in. Be sure to like the YouTube video. It helps with the YouTube search algorithms too. So y'all have a great week, and hopefully everybody will stay warmer than I am here. And you barely beat that. You barely got a little warmer than where we're at. So, Rabbi, thanks again. Love you, man. We'll talk to you soon. Shalom.